Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to step into a night that still lingers in my bones. A night when silence weighed heavier than pain. A night when the people I had given everything to, my children, my family, were nowhere to be found. I want you to imagine this with me. The clock is glowing on the nightstand, 3:47 a.m. The kind of hour when the world feels hushed, suspended between darkness and dawn. I'm sitting by the phone, one hand pressed to my temple, the other dialing number after number. My head feels like it's splitting in two, a steady hammer pounding from inside. The kind of pain that makes you wonder if you'll survive until morning. And yet, the harder pain is not the headache, it's the silence. The unanswered calls, the rejection tucked inside every voicemail. I dial my son. Straight to voicemail. I call my daughter-in-law. When she finally picks up, her voice is sharp, annoyed. I can hear laughter in the background, vacation sounds, clinking glasses. "Don't bother us," she says. And just like that, the line goes dead. That sentence, those 3 words, cut deeper than any illness. Don't bother. United States. I sit there, phone in my lap, the world spinning in front of me. How did I get here? How did a life built on sacrifice and love turn into this kind of abandonment? I wasn't just calling for comfort, I was calling for survival. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Because sometimes, stories like these travel farther than the voices of the people we need most. That night became a turning point. Not because I was saved by anyone, but because I realized something brutal and honest. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. And maybe, just maybe, that realization was what I needed. Not to break me, but to wake me up. This is not a story about miracles or happy endings. It is a story about truth, about sacrifice without return, about giving until you're empty and discovering that emptiness is all you have left. So tonight, as I take you through my journey, I want you to listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. Pause when the silence hits. Feel the weight of the unanswered call. Because every pause in my story is a pause I lived through in real time. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes letting go is the only way to survive. I remember the years that led me to that night. They didn't come out of nowhere. No betrayal is born in a single moment. It grows, little by little, over time. And the worst part? It grows quietly, so quietly, that you almost believe it's normal. I was a mother before I was anything else, before I was a woman with dreams, before I was a person with needs. My children became my world, and I wore sacrifice like a badge of honor. I can still see it, the first apartment we lived in after my divorce. It wasn't much. Peeling paint on the windowsills, secondhand furniture that creaked every time you sat down. But it was filled with hope. I told myself, if I just work hard enough, if I just give enough, my children will never feel the lack I felt. And so I worked. Double shifts, overtime hours, nights when exhaustion wrapped itself around my bones, but I pushed through because they needed shoes, or books, or the latest school trip their classmates were going on. I told myself, one day they'll understand. One day they'll see what I've done. But children don't notice the tired hands washing dishes at midnight. They don't hear the quiet sobs behind closed doors when bills don't match the paycheck. They don't feel the empty side of the bed that no one ever filled. Still, I gave. I gave because love meant giving, didn't it? That's what I believed. And then they grew older. First came college. I remember the pride swelling in me as my son held his acceptance letter. I cried that night, not just because he'd made it, but because I had somehow managed to make it possible. I drained savings, took loans, skipped doctor's appointments for myself, all so he could walk into a future I never had. But here's the part no one tells you. When you give and give without limits, people stop seeing it as a gift. They see it as normal, expected, like a faucet that should always run. And when the water slows, instead of gratitude, they feel anger. I remember writing check after check for tuition, for rent, for emergencies that always seemed to appear at the worst times. Each time I handed over money, I told myself it was an investment in love. But love, I would learn later, is not a transaction. Years passed. Graduations came and went. Weddings followed. I gave again. Dresses. Venues. Down payments for houses that were never mine, but always carried a piece of my sacrifice. And then the grandchildren came. The most beautiful part of my life, or so I thought. Their tiny hands wrapped around my fingers. Their laughter filling my home. I told myself, this is worth it. This is what it was all for. Babysitting became my second job. 3 days a week, sometimes more. Late nights when my son and his wife wanted time for themselves. I didn't complain, not once, because those children gave me joy. But slowly, even that joy was twisted. Every smile, every giggle came wrapped in conditions. I had to play by their rules, seek permission for traditions I once dreamed of sharing. A grandmother, but never fully free to love the way I wanted. And through it all, I kept giving. Money for lessons, clothes when budgets were tight, trips that somehow always needed an extra contribution from me. I told myself, this is love. This is family. This is what mothers do. But late at night, when the house grew silent and the weight of years pressed against me, a quiet question began to rise. What about me? It felt selfish to even think it. Selfish to want rest. Selfish to want care. Selfish to want, for once, to be on the receiving end of love. But when I sat in that hospital room, pain slicing through my skull, silence ringing louder than any machine, the truth I had been avoiding for decades finally surfaced. My sacrifices had not bought me love. They had bought me expectation. They had bought me the role of a servant in my own family. And I had allowed it. The memories kept flashing through me that night. Every dollar given, every favor done, every hour of sleep lost. It was like seeing my entire life spread across a table, and all the pieces spelled one message. They took. You gave. And now, when you need them, they are gone. I thought back to the promises. We'll pay you back soon, Mom. We'll make sure you're never alone. We'll take care of you one day. Words that once felt sweet now tasted bitter, because promises without action are just lies wrapped in hope. I leaned back against the hospital pillow, clutching the notepad they'd given me, and I began to write. A list. On one side, everything I had given. On the other, everything I had received. 3 pages of giving, barely a line of return. And as my pen scratched against the paper, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth without sugarcoating. And the truth was harsh, but also strangely freeing. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't imagining neglect where there was none. I had been living in it all along. And now, with my body weak and my head pounding, the truth finally demanded to be faced. I looked at the phone one last time that night, still silent, still empty. And I knew the people I had sacrificed everything for would not be the ones to save me. The sound of her voice is something I'll never forget. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, sharp, clipped, like my call was nothing more than an inconvenience. I had dialed her number with trembling fingers, each press of the keypad sending a bolt of hope and fear through me. Maybe this time, I thought. Maybe she'll hear the weakness in my voice. Maybe she'll sense the urgency. Maybe she'll care. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And then she answered. I could hear laughter in the background, the kind of laughter that belongs to warm vacation nights. Drinks clinking, music floating, children squealing in pools. Life, easy and bright, spilling into my ear through the line. Marlene, do you know what time it is? She asked. Her voice wasn't just annoyed. It was dripping with something colder. A warning. A boundary I was apparently not allowed to cross. I swallowed, my throat dry. I'm sorry to wake you. I'm not feeling well. I think I need to go to the hospital. Is Miles there? There was a pause. Not a pause of concern, not the kind that means she's rushing to get him. It was the pause of someone covering the phone, whispering to another, weighing whether or not to even bother. Then her voice returned, sharper than before. "We're on a family vacation, Marlene. We came here to have uninterrupted time with the kids. Please don't call again." And just like that, the line went dead. For a few moments I couldn't move. The silence in the room grew heavier than the pounding in my head. I stared at the glowing numbers on the phone screen, waiting for it to light up again, waiting for her to realize the cruelty in her words, waiting for Miles to call me back. But the phone stayed dark. I sat there, stunned, the echo of her voice bouncing around inside me. Not to bother them, not to disturb their happiness, not to remind them that the person who had once held their entire world together was now falling apart. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. It was the confirmation of something I had tried to deny for years, that my presence in their lives was conditional. Conditional on what I could provide, conditional on how useful I was. And in that moment, when I was the one in need, I wasn't useful at all. My mind spun back to memories that now felt twisted under the weight of her words. The times she had asked me to watch the children for just a few hours, that always turned into an entire weekend. The times she had asked me to contribute a little extra for tuition, for medical bills, for vacations. The times she had smiled politely, thanking me with words that sounded sweet but carried no warmth. And me, always eager, always ready, convincing myself that this was what family was, that this was love. But now, with her dismissal still ringing in my ears, I could see the truth with brutal clarity. I was not family, I was staff, a babysitter, a bank account, an extra pair of hands to lift the weight they didn't want to carry. Not a mother, not a grandmother, not someone worth a second thought when the phone rang in the night. The pain in my head pulsed harder, but it was the pain in my chest that almost brought me to my knees. How do you measure the worth of a life when the people you've given everything to can't even be bothered to answer a call? How do you tell yourself you matter when their laughter on vacation is louder than your cries for help? I remember pressing the phone to my heart, as though the metal and glass might still hold the warmth of connection. But it was cold, just like her voice, just like the silence that followed. Hours passed, doctors came and went, nurses adjusted machines. But in the back of my mind, the only thing I heard was that sentence, that final command to disappear, to stop needing, to stop existing in their perfect little world. Please don't call again. And in those 4 words, years of illusions shattered. Every sacrifice, every moment of pride, every hope that one day I would be cherished, it all crumbled. Because love doesn't hang up. Love doesn't say, "Don't bother." Love shows up, even in the middle of the night, even on vacation, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then. As the sun began to rise outside the hospital window, I realized something had changed in me. Something subtle, but undeniable. The begging part of me, the part that had always hoped, always waited, always made excuses, was dying. And in its place, a new awareness was taking root. I could no longer deny the truth. I had built my life around people who could discard me with a single sentence. And if that was true, then maybe it was time to start building something else. Something that belonged only to me. But before I could rebuild, I had to face the coldness fully. I had to let myself feel it, even though it burned. Because only by feeling the full weight of that rejection could I finally begin to let go. The hospital room was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes you, but the kind that makes every sound feel sharp and lonely. The steady beep of the heart monitor, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of nurses' shoes in the hallway outside. Each sound reminded me of the absence of the one thing I craved most: family. I had spent a lifetime making sure no one in my family ever had to sit alone. Through sickness, through loss, through every struggle, I was there. A hand on their back, a warm meal at the ready, a reassuring voice telling them it would be all right, even when I wasn't sure myself. But now, when my own body was trembling, when fear pressed against my ribs, I looked around the sterile white walls and saw nothing but emptiness. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and plastic, a smell that clung to the air like a reminder that this was not home. This was a place for the broken, the fragile, the forgotten. And for the first time, I realized I belonged here not because of my illness, but because of what my life had become. I stared at the chair in the corner, its plastic frame waiting for a visitor who would never arrive. It looked almost mocking in its vacancy. That chair had held me countless times when I sat beside my children's beds. Fevers, injuries, heartbreaks. I was always there. I remembered holding my son's hand when he broke his arm as a boy, whispering promises that the pain would fade. I remembered staying overnight when my daughter-in-law had her first child, bringing her water, adjusting pillows, making sure she had what she needed. That chair had been filled with my devotion. Now it sat empty, staring back at me, a silent witness to the irony of my situation. The IV drip ticked rhythmically beside me, like a metronome counting down the seconds of solitude. Every beep, every drop, was another moment my family wasn't there. It was another piece of evidence, undeniable and cold, that the people I had loved most had other priorities. The doctor stopped by that morning. He was kind in the way professionals often are, measured, calm, efficient. "Your blood pressure was dangerously high when you arrived," he explained. "We'll keep you overnight for observation. Try to rest." Rest. As though closing my eyes could silence the storm inside me. As though rest could replace the comfort of a familiar voice telling me I wasn't alone. I nodded numbly, clutching the thin hospital blanket, though it offered little warmth. Before he left, I asked softly, almost like a child asking for permission, "Did anyone call back?" My son? My daughter-in-law? The doctor's expression softened, but his answer was devastating. "We tried the number you gave us several times. No answer. No answer." Two words that sliced deeper than any diagnosis ever could. Because what he was really saying was, "You are not important enough. Not important enough for them to pick up the phone. Not important enough to be missed." I lay back against the pillow, and for a moment, I let myself imagine a different version of this room. One where the chair in the corner was filled with my son, his hand gripping mine with concern. One where my grandchildren were drawing pictures to cheer me up. One where my daughter-in-law set aside her vacation to be present, even reluctantly. But fantasies are cruel when you know they'll never come true. I blinked and the vision dissolved, leaving behind nothing but sterile walls and the echo of absence. The truth pressed down on me like the weight of the blanket. Heavy, suffocating. This room wasn't just empty because they weren't here tonight. It was empty because I had built my life around people who had no space for me in theirs. The silence was no accident. It was the pattern of years, revealed in its purest form. A nurse came in later to check my vitals. She was young, probably not much older than my son when he first left for college. She smiled kindly, adjusted the monitor, and said, "Do you need anything?" Her voice was soft, and yet it almost broke me, because here was a stranger offering me the tenderness my own family withheld. "No," I whispered, my voice catching. "Thank you." She gave me a look, the kind of look people give when they sense there's more pain than what the machines reveal. And then she left, leaving behind a faint trace of perfume that lingered in the air. A reminder that not all care is conditional. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster, each one a line in the story of my neglect. I thought of all the nights I had soothed crying children, all the mornings I had rushed to help, all the years I had bent myself into shapes so they would never feel alone. And here I was, alone in the one place that magnified loneliness more than anywhere else, a hospital room. It wasn't just loneliness. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when every illusion finally collapses. I wasn't an afterthought. I wasn't forgotten by mistake. I was ignored on purpose, and that knowledge stung more than the IV needle piercing my arm. At some point, I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under my feet, grounding me in reality. I picked up the notepad on the bedside table. And I began to write. I wrote about the room, the emptiness, the chair in the corner, the silence that felt louder than any scream. I wrote it all down because I knew one day, if I let myself forget, I would slip back into denial, and I couldn't afford to forget again. The words flowed, jagged and uneven, but they were mine, and in the act of writing, I found a strange kind of company. The page couldn't abandon me, the ink couldn't hang up on me. The notebook, at least, would hold my truth. When the nurse returned in the early hours, she found me sitting upright, pen in hand, paper scattered across the blanket. "Can't sleep?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "I'm making lists," I said. She tilted her head, curious. "What kind of lists?" I looked down at the words I had etched, shaky but firm. "Everything I've given," I replied, "and everything I've received." She didn't say anything at first, but her silence wasn't cold. It was heavy with understanding. Finally, she said softly, "That's a brave list to make." And then she squeezed my hand, just for a moment, before leaving me with my thoughts. Back in the silence, I studied the pages I had written. The imbalance was undeniable. 3 pages of sacrifices, barely a line of return. And as the IV dripped and the machines hummed, I knew this hospital room had given me something my family never had. The truth, stripped bare. No excuses, no illusions, just the reality of my life. The empty hospital room had spoken louder than any words my children had ever said. And its message was clear. You cannot rely on them. Not now. Not ever. When I look back now, I realize my life can be divided into 2 columns, what I gave away, and what I kept for myself. The tragedy is that the second column is almost empty. For decades, I convinced myself that giving was the highest form of love, that the more I poured into others, the fuller my own heart would feel. But as I sat in that hospital bed, scribbling furiously into my notepad, the truth began to rise like a bruise, deep, painful, undeniable. I hadn't just given them money or time. I had given away pieces of myself until there was barely anything left to claim. The first things to go were the small dreams, the painting classes I once wanted to take, the trips I told myself I'd plan someday, the books I never opened because I was too busy running to babysit or cover another emergency. Those things were easy to set aside at first. After all, what kind of mother would I be if I put myself before my children? So I told myself no, over and over again. No to art. No to rest. No to me. In their place, I said yes. Yes to staying late at work so tuition could be paid. Yes to draining my savings for a down payment on their first house. Yes to weekend after weekend spent caring for children who weren't mine, but felt like mine. Yes to every request that came wrapped in the words, "just this once," even though it was never just once. Money was the most obvious sacrifice. I can still see the numbers on the checks I wrote. $500 for books, $2,000 for rent, $20,000 for the down payment on a house that never had my name on the deed. Each time, I told myself it was temporary, that they would pay me back, that it wasn't really gone, just delayed. But years passed, promises faded, and the money was gone for good. Not stolen, not exactly, but taken in a way that left me just as empty. What they never seemed to realize was that money wasn't infinite for me. I wasn't some wealthy benefactor with bottomless pockets. Every dollar I gave them was a dollar I denied myself. A doctor's visit I postponed. A repair I ignored. A security I gave away. And yet, when they looked at me, they didn't see sacrifice. They saw convenience. They saw resources. They saw someone they could lean on indefinitely. But money was only the surface. What I really gave away was time. Time. The one currency you can never earn back. I gave away afternoons that could have been spent painting, evenings that could have been spent with friends, weekends that could have been spent exploring places I had only read about. Instead, my calendar was filled with their needs, their emergencies, their convenience. I remember one Saturday in particular. I had been invited by a neighbor to join a small hiking group. Something light, nothing strenuous, just a few women exploring a trail and sharing conversation. I was excited. I had laid out my shoes, packed a small bag, even allowed myself the rare luxury of anticipation. But the night before, my phone rang. "Mom, can you watch the kids tomorrow? We really need a break." I hesitated. I wanted to say no. I wanted to claim just one day for myself. But guilt is a heavy chain, and I had been wearing it for years. So I sighed, folded away my plans, and said yes. The shoes went back into the closet. The bag was unpacked, and my life of self-denial continued. They never asked me how I felt about giving up my plans. They never even knew, because I never told them. I didn't want them to see me as selfish. But selfishness is not the same as survival, and it took me decades to understand the difference. Dreams were another casualty. I had dreamed once of seeing Italy, not for luxury, not for show, but because I wanted to walk streets filled with history, to touch walls older than anything I had ever known, to breathe in the art and the culture that had lived in my imagination since I was a girl. I promised myself I would go someday, but someday never came, because there was always another bill to cover, another babysitting shift, another sacrifice to make. I watched my children travel instead. Vacations I had paid for, trips they took without me. They sent postcards sometimes, short notes scribbled as though they were doing me a favor by remembering. And I would smile, put the card on the fridge, and tell myself their joy was enough for me. But in the quiet of the night, I would stare at those pictures and ache for the life I had postponed into oblivion. The cruelest thing I gave away wasn't money, or time, or even dreams. It was myself. Piece by piece, I eroded. I stopped being Marlene, the woman with laughter that once filled rooms. I became Marlene, the provider. Marlene, the reliable. Marlene, the woman who could always be counted on to say yes. I gave away my voice. Every time I stayed silent when they overlooked me. Every time I smiled politely when they dismissed me. Every time I swallowed my hurt so they could feel comfortable. I gave away my dignity. Every time I accepted being treated like staff. Every time I let their convenience outweigh my worth. Every time I believed their needs were greater than mine. And in return, I received scraps. A thank you here. A polite nod there. Enough to keep me hoping, but never enough to make me whole. That night in the hospital, as I stared at the pages of my list, I realized just how devastating the imbalance was. The column of giving stretched on endlessly. The column of receiving barely took up space. It wasn't just unfair, it was unsustainable. No one can live their entire life pouring into others without ever being filled in return. You don't just run out of resources, you run out of yourself. And I had run out. The pain in my head, the weakness in my body, even the loneliness in that hospital room, it was all connected. It was the cost of years of unchecked giving, the cost of believing that love was earned through sacrifice alone, the cost of forgetting that I, too, was worthy of care. As I set down the pen that night, my hands trembling with exhaustion, I whispered something into the silence. A sentence I had never dared to say before. No more. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And in that moment, it felt like the most powerful thing I had ever given myself. No more endless giving without return. No more erasing myself to make room for others. No more sacrificing dreams I had every right to claim. I had given away too much already, and though it terrified me, I knew it was time to start keeping something for myself. Promises are such fragile things. They begin as warm words, soft as whispers, heavy with hope. But if not kept, they wither. And what remains is not just disappointment. It is betrayal disguised as forgetfulness. I think about all the promises my children once made to me. How easily they spoke them. How eagerly I believed them. How quietly they vanished. The first one came after college. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of bills spread before me like a battlefield. My son reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "Mom, as soon as I graduate, I'll start paying you back. All the loans, all the sacrifices." I promise I held on to those words like a lifeline. Every check I wrote after that moment felt lighter, because I believed repayment was coming. I believed one day I would breathe freely, debt erased, dignity restored. But years went by. Graduation came and went. He got a job, then a promotion, then another. The subject of repayment never returned. Not even once. The promise dissolved into silence, like it had never been spoken. Another promise came at his wedding. I remember standing there, a smile plastered across my face, my heart breaking quietly in my chest, as I signed yet another check. I told myself it was worth it, worth the years of saving, worth the sacrifices, because my son looked at me that day with eyes full of gratitude. "Don't worry, Mom," he said as he hugged me. "This wedding will always include you. You'll never feel left out, I promise." But as the years passed, invitations grew fewer. Family dinners happened without me. Vacations were planned in whispers. Barbecues, parties, gatherings. I learned about them after the fact, through photos or secondhand mentions. The promise of inclusion faded, replaced by carefully constructed distance. I was part of the family in name, but not in practice. The promises surrounding the grandchildren cut deepest of all. I remember holding my first grandchild in my arms, tears streaming down my face, joy flooding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, my son looked at me and said, "You'll always be their special person, Mom. You'll always matter to them, I promise." But promises don't raise children, actions do, and the actions painted a different story. I wanted to share traditions with them, baking cookies at Christmas, zoo trips in the summer, bedtime stories that carried pieces of my own childhood. But each time, I was told no. Or worse, "We'll see." Everything had to be filtered through their mother's approval. And more often than not, approval never came. Slowly, I realized I wasn't the special person I'd been promised. I was a caretaker, convenient, temporary, a shadow presence in their lives, present when needed, dismissed when not. And then there were the everyday promises, the ones so small they almost seemed meaningless, until they added up. "I'll call you tomorrow." The phone never rang. "I'll stop by this weekend." The weekend passed in silence. "I'll check on you later." Later never came. Each broken promise was like a thread snapping in the fabric of my trust. One or two could be overlooked, excused as forgetfulness. But after years of snapped threads, the fabric unraveled completely. The cruelest part was how natural it became for them to break promises. They didn't even realize they were doing it anymore. To them, promises were just words, thrown out like breadcrumbs to keep me following, to keep me hoping, to keep me giving. And I followed. I followed because I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe my sacrifices weren't invisible. I wanted to believe my children were better than their actions. I wanted to believe family was more than convenience, but the hospital room stripped away every illusion. As I lay there alone, clutching the notepad with my lists, I thought of every promise spoken to me, and how not a single one had held. There was one conversation I can't shake. It was years ago, after another long night of babysitting. I had stayed late, later than planned, rocking my grandson to sleep while his parents enjoyed a night out. When they finally returned, I was exhausted, my body aching, but I smiled anyway. My daughter-in-law kissed her son goodnight, turned to me, and said, "We couldn't do this without you. We'll make sure you're taken care of one day." I promise I drove home that night glowing. Her words felt genuine, almost like acceptance, almost like family. I believed her, but the one day never came. Because promises spoken in comfort mean nothing if they aren't lived in action. I think that's what hurt the most, not just the absence of help, but the presence of lies. Because every time they said, "I promise," they built hope inside me. And every time they broke it, they shattered me a little more. The silence of the hospital room reminded me of all those shatterings. It wasn't just that they weren't there. It was that they had promised to be. People often say that promises are sacred, that they're the glue holding families together. But my family's glue had dissolved long ago. What held us together now wasn't love or loyalty. It was habit. A habit of me giving, them taking, and all of us pretending it was normal. But I couldn't pretend anymore. The forgotten promises had piled too high, and the weight of them was crushing me. So I made a promise of my own, not to them, to myself. I promised that I would never again believe words without actions. I promised I would never again let empty promises dictate my worth. I promised that from now on, the only promise I would cling to was the one I made in that silent room, to finally choose myself. Patterns don't reveal themselves all at once. They creep in slowly, like shadows at dusk, until one day you look around and realize the darkness has already consumed you. That is what my life with my children had become. A pattern of taking, so constant, so relentless, that it stopped feeling like a request and started feeling like a law. It always began the same way. The phone would ring. Their voices would carry urgency, coated with just enough sweetness to disguise the demand beneath. "Mom, we really need your help." Just this once. It would mean so much. And I always answered yes. Not because I wanted to, not always, but because I believed that love meant never saying no. At first, the requests felt reasonable. Babysitting for an evening, a small loan to cover a bill, driving them to an appointment. Little things that seemed harmless in isolation. But the problem with little things is that they multiply. One evening became every weekend. One loan became thousands of dollars that were never repaid. One ride became an unspoken expectation that I would always be available, always on call. I became less a person, more a service. Not Marlene, the mother, the grandmother, the woman, but Marlene, the provider. Marlene, the free babysitter. Marlene, the walking wallet. I remember one weekend in particular. I had been feeling unwell all week, nothing dramatic, just the kind of fatigue that seeps into your bones and makes every step heavy. I planned to spend Saturday resting, maybe reading a book, maybe sitting in the garden and letting the sun warm my skin. But Saturday morning, the phone rang. "Mom, we're desperate. Can you take the kids? We need a break." I hesitated. The no was right there, perched on my lips. But then came the guilt. The reminder of all the times I had told myself that good mothers don't deny their children. So I said yes. Again. That day, as I chased toddlers through the living room, exhaustion clawing at my chest, I realized my rest, my health, my plans. None of it mattered. The pattern had already swallowed me whole. The requests weren't always about time. Sometimes they were financial, and those cut the deepest. I lost count of how many times I dipped into savings to cover their emergencies. There was always a reason: rent, tuition, car repairs, new clothes for the kids. Always urgent. Always phrased as though the world would collapse without my help. And every time, I gave. I gave because I told myself that's what family does. But over time, I realized the pattern wasn't about emergencies. It was about convenience. Because when I was the one in need, when my fridge broke, when my car failed, when medical bills piled up, the phone didn't ring. No one came rushing to cover me. No one said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll handle it." The pattern was clear. I gave, they took, and that was the end of it. The cruelest part was how normal it became. The pattern was so ingrained that they didn't even bother with gratitude anymore. The requests stopped being framed as favors and became framed as obligations. "Can you take the kids?" became, "You'll take the kids, right?" "Could you help us with this bill?" became, "We need you to cover it." And me, I complied. Because patterns have power. Once you step into them, breaking free feels impossible. I remember another moment, years later. I had just returned from the hospital after a minor procedure. I was weak, sore, and desperately in need of rest. The phone rang the very next day. "Mom, we need you to come over. The kids are driving us crazy." I explained softly that I wasn't well, that I needed a few days to recover. There was silence on the other end. Then a sigh. And then the words that still sting. "Fine. We'll figure something else out. But you know, it'd be nice if you thought of us for once." Thought of them. As if decades of sacrifice had been nothing. As if my request for one small pause, one small boundary, was selfish. That was when I realized the truth. The pattern had rewritten the rules of our relationship. They weren't asking anymore. They were expecting. And the moment I didn't deliver, I became the villain. The thing about patterns is that they blind you. You stop noticing how much you're losing because the cycle distracts you. Another request comes in, another sacrifice is made, and you don't have the time or space to measure the damage. But lying in that hospital bed, the silence wrapping around me, I finally saw the full picture. Every dollar I gave, every hour I lost, every dream I abandoned. They weren't isolated moments. They were pieces of a pattern, a design that benefited everyone but me. And the worst part? I had built it myself. Brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, I had trained them to see me not as a mother, not as a person, but as a resource. I don't think they ever sat down and planned to use me. It wasn't malicious in the beginning. It was easier than that. I made it too easy. I was too quick to say yes, too eager to please, too afraid of being left out. And so the pattern grew. Until eventually, it no longer felt like a pattern. It just felt like life. But patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. And as I stared at the walls of that empty hospital room, I felt anger stirring beneath the grief. Not anger at them, not entirely, but anger at myself, for letting it go on so long, for believing that love was proven only through sacrifice, for building a life where the only role I was allowed to play was the giver. The pattern had cost me everything, and I knew, deep in my bones, that if I didn't break it now, it would cost me what little remained. So I whispered another quiet vow into the silence. No more patterns of taking. No more living as a resource. No more letting myself be consumed. I didn't yet know what breaking free would look like, but I knew this. The first step was seeing the pattern clearly, and now, finally, I could. There comes a moment in every story when the veil lifts, when the illusions you've clung to, no matter how comforting, dissolve under the weight of truth. For me, that moment came not in a dramatic explosion, but in the quiet hum of a hospital room surrounded by sterile walls and the echo of absence. It was there, in that silence, that I finally faced the harshest realization of all. I wasn't family. Not really. Not to them. I was staff. The thought startled me at first. I recoiled from it, tried to soften it with excuses. Of course they loved me, I told myself. Of course they cared. They were just busy. They were just distracted. It was bad timing. But the excuses crumbled as soon as I tested them against reality. If love is real, it shows up. If care is true, it answers the phone. If family is family, it doesn't tell you not to bother them while you're in pain. The truth was sharper than any headache, more cutting than any diagnosis. I had spent years believing I was the backbone of the family, when in fact I was simply the scaffolding, necessary when things needed to be built, invisible once the structure was standing. Memories began to replay, now with new clarity. The family dinners where I cooked and cleaned, while everyone else laughed and talked. The birthdays where I paid for the cake, bought the gifts, decorated the room, and then watched from the sidelines as they posed for pictures without me. The vacations I never took, but funded in quiet checks, slipped into my son's hands. And through it all, I told myself, this is what mothers do. This is love. But in the hospital silence, I could no longer lie to myself. What I had called love was to them service. What I had called devotion was to them labor. What I had called sacrifice was to them expected. One memory in particular burned in my mind. It was Christmas Eve a few years ago. I had spent days preparing, cooking, cleaning, decorating the house so it would feel warm and welcoming. I imagined laughter around the table, stories shared, memories made. But when they arrived, they carried with them the chill of obligation. My daughter-in-law walked in, barely glancing at the decorations I had hung with care. She handed me a list of special things her children could and could not eat, as if my cooking were not already an act of love, but a task to be supervised. My son barely spoke to me, his attention swallowed by his phone. And when dinner was over, they left quickly, rushing to another gathering, one I had not been invited to. I stood in the doorway that night, the cold air biting my cheeks as I watched their car disappear into the dark. The table behind me was still set, the candles still burning, the food still warm. And I realized I had been nothing more than a pit stop, a duty to check off, before they went to the places where they truly wanted to be. That night was supposed to be filled with family. Instead, it was filled with the hollow ache of being unnecessary. The hospital room brought that memory back with cruel intensity, and in its light, the realization crystallized. I had never been at the center of their family. I had only ever been orbiting it, useful when called upon, forgotten when not. The word staff kept echoing in my head. At first, it felt too harsh, too bitter. But the more I examined it, the more accurate it became. Staff show up when needed. Staff perform tasks. Staff are thanked politely, but not cherished. Staff are replaceable. And that's how they treated me. Replaceable. The worst part wasn't their coldness. It was how easily I had accepted it. How I had trained myself to believe scraps of attention were love. How I had convinced myself that being useful was the same as being valued. I lay back against the pillow, the monitor beeping steadily beside me, and let the realization wash over me. It hurt, yes. It gutted me, stripping away decades of denial. But beneath the pain, there was also something else: relief. Because once you stop pretending, once you call the truth by its real name, you can finally begin to make choices that match reality. And reality was this: I was not loved for who I was. I was tolerated for what I gave. I thought of the countless times I had played the role of savior, covering debts, watching children, offering rides, cooking meals, smiling through exhaustion. Each act had chipped away at me, but I had clung to the belief that one day they would look back and realize how much I mattered. But they didn't, and they never would, because people who see you as staff don't suddenly wake up and see you as family. Not unless something changes, and that something, I realized, had to be me. The nurse came in again that night, her hands gentle as she checked my vitals. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. I almost laughed at the understatement. Quiet didn't begin to cover it. I was submerged in silence, drowning in realizations I could no longer ignore. "I've been thinking," I whispered. She smiled kindly. "About what?" I looked her in the eye and for the first time said the words out loud. That I'm not family to them. Not really, I'm staff. Her expression shifted, a flicker of sorrow crossing her face. She didn't argue. She didn't try to reassure me with empty words. She just nodded, as if to say, "I see it too." And somehow, that honesty felt like the first act of kindness I had received in years. The harsh realization settled deep in my bones. It wasn't going to leave me, and I didn't want it to, because pain, when acknowledged, can become power. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking what was wrong with me. I stopped asking why they didn't love me enough. The answer was simpler, colder, but clearer. They never saw me as someone to love. They saw me as someone to use. And now that I knew the truth, I had a choice. I could either continue playing the role of staff until the day I died, or I could finally resign from the job I had never applied for in the first place. As the lights dimmed in the hallway and the hospital slipped into night, I closed my eyes and let the thought settle. I wasn't family, I wasn't loved. But maybe, just maybe, that realization was the first step toward freedom. The phone finally rang 2 days later. I had almost stopped expecting it. Almost stopped glancing at the screen every few minutes, hoping for his name to appear. But when it finally did, when the letters MILES lit up in pale blue across the screen, I felt the same jolt of hope I had been denying myself. I stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding harder than the machines beside me. Then I pressed accept. "Mom," he said, his voice casual, too casual, as if nothing had happened. We just got back from Cabo. It was amazing. The kids had the best time. I closed my eyes. There it was again. The laughter, the joy, the life they had been living while I sat alone in a hospital bed. And he was telling me all about it, as if it were a gift. I was in the hospital, I said softly. There was silence on the other end. Not long, not loud. Just a pause that told me everything. He hadn't known. He hadn't even noticed I was gone. When? He asked finally. 2 nights ago, I replied. I had a severe headache. My blood pressure was dangerously high. I called. I called you. I called Joy. No one came. Another silence. This one heavier, more deliberate. Then his voice, fumbling, defensive. Mom, we didn't know it was serious. If you had told us, it would have been different. Different. The word lodged itself in my chest. Would it really have been different? Or would it have been another excuse, another empty reassurance meant to keep me quiet? You told me not to bother you, I said, my voice trembling now. Joy said you were on vacation and that I shouldn't call again. He inhaled sharply, as though the truth had burned him. But instead of apology, his next words came out like a shield. She didn't mean it like that. You're overreacting. Overreacting. That word, that weapon. How many times had it been used against me? How many times had my pain been minimized, my sacrifice dismissed, my needs painted as too much? I felt something inside me snap. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was clarity. Maybe it was simply the exhaustion of decades finally spilling out. I've given you everything, I said, louder now, the words breaking past the dam I had built around them. I paid for your school. I helped you buy your house. I raised your children while you enjoyed your life. And when I needed you, once, just once, you weren't there. You didn't even answer the phone. Mom, he began, but I cut him off. Number, you don't get to call me Mom in this moment, not when you've treated me like staff. Staff you don't even pay, staff you don't even thank, staff you discard the moment they're inconvenient. The line was quiet. So quiet I thought he might have hung up. But then I heard him exhale. That's not fair, he muttered. We've done so much for you. I laughed bitterly. For me? Tell me, Miles, what exactly have you done for me? Name one thing, just one moment when you sacrificed for me the way I've sacrificed for you. He hesitated. The silence stretched, long and unbearable, because he had no answer. None that was true, at least. Finally, he said, We've included you in our lives. You've been there for the kids. They love you. Isn't that enough? Love without respect is not love, I whispered. Attention only when it's convenient is not love. You don't call that family, Miles. You call that use. My hand shook as I gripped the phone tighter, but my voice grew steadier with every word. I needed you, and you chose Cabo. The air between us grew heavy, filled with words unspoken, truths unacknowledged. Finally, he spoke again, his tone colder now, sharper. Look, Mom, we can't change what happened. What's done is done. But the kids miss you. We're having a barbecue this weekend. Joy's parents will be there. You should come. I blinked, stunned. A barbecue. As if nothing had happened. As if my hospitalization, my pain, my loneliness could be erased by grilled meat and small talk. Come, he repeated, his voice firm now, almost commanding. Bring something for the table. The kids want to see you. And that was the final crack in the illusion. Not only had they dismissed my suffering, but they were already asking for more. Already pulling me back into the pattern of giving, as though my pain was just a minor inconvenience. I drew in a long, shaky breath. No, I said simply. The line went silent. When he spoke again, his voice was incredulous. What do you mean, no? I mean, I said, my voice steady now, that I will not come. Not this time. Not when you can't even acknowledge what you've done. I was alone in a hospital bed, Miles. Alone. And you want me to bring potato salad to a barbecue? His voice rose, frustration spilling through. You're being dramatic. You're blowing this out of proportion. Joy's parents will think you're rude. I almost laughed. The absurdity of it. The way appearances mattered more to them than the truth. The way my pain was less important than their image. "Let them think what they want," I said softly. "I've played the part of the reliable mother, the dependable grandmother, the endless giver. I'm done playing that part. If they ask where I am, tell them the truth." I was too busy remembering what it feels like to be human. He sputtered, tried to argue, tried to twist the narrative back into something that would absolve him, but I had stopped listening, because for the first time, my voice had cut through the silence, and though it shook, though it ached, it was mine. When the call ended, I sat there in the hospital bed, phone still in my hand, heart pounding. I knew what would come next: anger, manipulation, guilt. They would push back. They would try to drag me back into the pattern. But I also knew this. The confrontation had changed something. The words had been spoken. The truth had been laid bare. And there was no going back. The phone call with my son left me drained. Not just tired in the body, but hollow in the spirit. It was as though I had been shouting across a canyon, my words echoing back to me with no bridge to carry them across. The silence that followed was heavier than the conversation itself. I thought I would spend the next few days sinking deeper into that emptiness. But then came a knock on my door. It was Eleanor, my neighbor, the woman who had lived down the street for years, always kind in passing, always ready with a wave and a smile. We had exchanged pleasantries, swapped recipes once or twice, and waved at each other's gardens. But we had never been more than neighbors. And yet, when she heard I had been in the hospital, she came. No hesitation, no excuses, just a knock on my door, a bag of groceries in her arms, and concern in her eyes. "I heard you weren't well," she said softly as I opened the door. "How are you feeling?" Her question was simple, but it pierced me more deeply than she could have known, because it had been so long, too long, since anyone had asked me that with genuine care. Not out of obligation, not as a lead-in to another request, but because she wanted to know. "I'm better," I said, my voice catching. "Thank you for coming." She stepped inside, setting the bag on the counter, fresh fruit, bread, a small bouquet of flowers she had cut from her garden. Little things, but they filled the room with warmth that no expensive gift could buy. "You shouldn't be alone," she said, matter of fact, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. And in that moment, I almost broke down. Because she was right, I shouldn't have been alone. And yet I was. We sat at the table, the same table where I had once signed countless checks for my son, the same table where I had waited for calls that never came. But now, across from me, sat a woman who owed me nothing, who had asked for nothing, and yet who gave more with her presence than my own family had in years. She listened as I told her about the hospital, about the silence, about the phone call that left me shaken. I expected her to interrupt, to offer platitudes like, "I'm sure they didn't mean it," or "Family can be difficult." But she didn't. She just listened. Her eyes steady, her face soft, her silence filled with understanding rather than dismissal. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Marlene," she said gently, "sometimes the people we expect the least from end up giving us the most." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and true, and I realized in that moment how starved I had been for kindness. It wasn't just about the groceries or the flowers. It was about the fact that she showed up. She noticed. She cared. It made me think about all the years I had spent waiting for my children to show up in the same way. All the times I had told myself that family was the only place love could be found. And here was Eleanor, disproving that with a single knock on my door. Over the next few days, she continued to check in, sometimes with soup, sometimes with just a smile and a quick chat. She asked about my health, about my sleep, about how I was really doing. Questions that seemed so small, yet carried so much weight because they were asked with sincerity. And I couldn't help but compare her actions to my children's absence. The contrast was blinding. Here was a neighbor, a near stranger, offering me the compassion my own family withheld. It made me realize something I had never dared to consider before. Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes family is defined by presence, by who shows up when the world grows dark, by who notices when you disappear into silence. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden sipping tea, Eleanor looked at me thoughtfully. "You've spent so long taking care of everyone else," she said. "Maybe it's time to let someone take care of you." Her words hit me harder than I expected, because they were so simple, so obvious, and yet they felt revolutionary. I had built my entire life around the idea that my worth came from giving, that to stop giving was to stop being valuable. But Eleanor's kindness revealed another possibility, that maybe I was worthy even without sacrifice, that maybe I deserved care simply because I existed. That evening, I sat in my living room long after she left, the bouquet of flowers still bright on the counter. I thought about the way she had looked at me, not with pity, but with respect, and I realized how rare that had become in my life. My children looked at me with expectation. My daughter-in-law looked at me with impatience, but Eleanor looked at me with humanity, and that difference was everything. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone, not to call my children, but to call a lawyer. I wanted to know what it would look like to protect myself, to draw boundaries, to make sure that my future wasn't dictated by the same pattern of taking that had drained my past. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also liberating, because Eleanor's concern had planted a seed in me, a seed of possibility, the possibility that I didn't have to keep living the same way, the possibility that I could choose differently. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about all the times I had begged for scraps of love from my family, all the nights I had cried over broken promises, all the years I had mistaken obligation for devotion. And then I thought about Eleanor's knock on the door. Simple, unannounced, full of genuine care. It made me realize something I had never dared to admit. I had been chasing love in the wrong places. And maybe, just maybe, the love I had been longing for didn't need to come from my children at all. The harshness of that truth was softened by Eleanor's kindness, because she showed me, in her quiet way, that love doesn't always look like grand gestures or lifelong bonds. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor with flowers. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting across from you, listening without judgment. Sometimes it looks like presence, and as I drifted into sleep that night, I realized something new. Maybe my future wouldn't be defined by who abandoned me.